Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Welcome to the Food Junkies podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your host today of Food Junkies, speaking with Dr. Jacob May about the effects of ultra-processed foods on our children. Dr. Jacob May is an associate professor at Pennington Biomedical Research Center. As head of the Mitochondrial, Energetics, and Nutritional and Nutrient Utilization Laboratory, he investigates how dietary patterns influence overall cellular metabolism. Dr. May's research aims to create precision nutrition, which involves tailoring diets to optimize health. He is especially interested in the effects of the ketogenic diet, identifying markers of malnutrition and the impact of ultra-processed foods on metabolic health. Additionally, he advocates for enhancing the role of dietitians in clinical care and disease prevention. Dr. May was a keynote speaker at Pennington's 2025 Childhood Obesity Conference, where he talked about how to combat pediatric obesity through personalized dietary interventions. We at Food Junkies are especially interested in how to help our children before they become addicted and impacted by ultra-processed foods. So welcome, Dr. May.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. Happy to be here and chat about nutrition, especially as it relates to our youth and making sure we're giving them really the best opportunity to grow and thrive.
Okay, how did you get into the field of precision nutrition, health, and obesity?
Okay. So way back when I was an early teenager, maybe about 12, 13 years old, I was always an athlete, so I liked to play football back then. And to play on the tackle football team, to be able to hold the football, you had to be below a certain weight. And I was always a heavier kid, but I was always athletic. But I had to cut down weight to be able to hold the football, which I really wanted to do. And I tried Slim Fast, I tried dieting, eating salads. I couldn't lose the weight. And so my dad, who was, like a casual bodybuilder in the 80s sort of guy, had read one of the Atkins books on the ketogenic diet. He's like, Jake, why don't you try this? And so as an early teen, I tried the ketogenic diet. The weight came right off. It was unbelievable, and I wasn't hungry. But I also noticed I had some headaches. I had some fatigue and I had low energy. And I just fell in love with how nutrition could impact the body, both the good and the bad. And from then on, I just went on and did my nutrition undergraduate, followed up with a PhD, got my registered dietitian credentials, and here I am, a clinical nutrition researcher.
Wow, that's interesting. I heard you say is that you lost a lot of weight, which we know happens with keto diet, but you also mentioned that you got headaches. I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but that's interesting because usually we don't hear that in the keto world.
Yeah, a lot of, especially in the media and whatnot, you always get the positive benefits of items. But it was really apparent to me when I changed my diet that I had physical effects that I could feel on my body. And weight loss, which was what I was going for, was outstanding. I got below the cutoff. It was perfect. But yeah, I did not feel as athletic as I had felt previously, especially in sports like football or doing my sprints. They felt harder. And that was something I noticed when I was young. And then nowadays we have the data that supports, hey, on ketogenic diets, it's probably not the best for high intensity performance. If you want to get into the endurance realm, there's maybe some different results there, but it aligns with what we know about carbohydrates being a quick, fast, and effective energy source, and really needing that for optimal high performance, at least in individuals that aren't doing the ketogenic diet for extremely long periods of time and maybe have different adaptations going on. But to me, it was just, oh my gosh, I could feel the effect of changing diet on my body. And as an early teenager, it was just something that kind of blew my mind. We always heard the adage, you are what you eat. But to me, it was so blunt when I changed my diet so dramatically and then had all these different physiologic results. Not that I understood the term physiologic at the time, but that it was just interesting to me.
You were really startled by the impact of diet on your life, basically. Okay, can you tell us, how does ultra-processed food impact mitochondrial function in our cells? What is the role of the mitochondria in the first place, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so let's start on the mitochondrial end, right? These are organelles in our body that take food and convert it to energy that our cells can use to move and to keep our heart pumping, right? And to be able to think cognitively. And so this is what the mitochondria do. They take your food you eat and they convert it into energy. When food gets to the mitochondria, just carbohydrates, proteins, fats, whatever it is, the mitochondria don't know the difference between it being from some fresh cut of beef versus some of your ultra-processed hamburgers, right? So it's not the macronutrients that are different between whole foods and these ultra-processed foods. It's everything else that goes along with the food product. So mitochondria-wise, when you talk about just the energy production, there's no real difference in terms of the macronutrient energy-producing items. But what could be different? In ultra-processed foods, you take out many of the non-nutritive factors that are in whole foods. These could be your phytonutrients or zoonutrients if they're from animal products, or if there's any chemists on here, right? Phytochemicals, zoochemicals. I like to call them phytonutrients and zoonutrients just because they're the items we eat and they can have potential positive health benefits on the body, but the technical word is chemical, right? But those are items that don't get processed by the mitochondria, but they can have different effects on the body. What's a really good example of this? Certain phytonutrients from plants, right, your fruits, vegetables, etc., have amazing associations with lower rates of risk of cardiovascular disease, right? So the more phytochemicals you intake, the potential protection you have from cardiovascular disease, right? Heart disease, those sort of items. Zoonutrient-wise, you can think of items like creatine that you get in your meat. This is a multi-amino acid small molecule that ends up getting into your muscles, can help you with energy production and strength and otherwise. That is in high-quality meat and beef products, and we call that a zoonutrient, right? So instead of coming from plants like phyto, it comes from animal products. Milk has a lot of either milk-based proteins, which have unique effects on the body. There's been some good data on improving bone mineral density, so that's an item from a milk product. There's bioactive lipids that can come from yogurts or otherwise. So you can understand that there's products in food items, whether they're plants or animals or otherwise, that can have positive effects on the body that don't necessarily go down to mitochondrial energy generation, right? On the opposite effect, right? So there's items in foods that are taken away when you do the ultra processing. There's also items that we put into foods during the ultra processing, right? And these are items that aren't normally present in nature, food additives, colorings, flavorings, right, for different items. Certainly tons of sugar and fats and otherwise to make the foods more palatable, but we'll focus on the non-nutritive end, right? So these are additives that we put in there that just aren't generally present in a normal human diet outside of ultra-processed food items. Those can have a range of effects on the body, whether that's related to potentially inducing inflammation or creating exposure to what we would otherwise consider to be toxins. Although the levels are very low, I don't want to create a scare tactic from it. Right? But there are ingredients that are put in that our bodies wouldn't normally consume otherwise. And so those can have effects on the body as well. So that's how I would describe the mitochondrial relationship with foods, which is just the processing of energy, and then the potential items that aren't in foods that don't necessarily make it to the mitochondria, and the potential items that are added into the ultra-processed foods that, again, aren't necessarily processed through the mitochondria like we normally would, but can have whole body systemic effects that might be related to human health and disease.
Okay, so you're saying that the mitochondria can't distinguish between a McDonald's burger and a slice of organic beef?
Unfortunately, it can't. In my mind, it would be nice if it could, to be honest with you.
But the fact that it's a McDonald's burger, there's all sorts of other stuff that's in there, and that has impacts that are non-mitochondrial, but still very important.
Absolutely. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that there's the potential that some of these additives or the lack of food components, the ones that are the healthy ones that are removed, that they could in some way impact mitochondrial function. We just don't have a great understanding of how or why that might happen. So I don't want to dismiss the potential that these items that are removed or put in can impact mitochondria. But in general, I would prefer to think of the mitochondria as processing those nutritive components. And the mitochondria don't really understand where those nutritive components are coming from.
Okay, so ultra-processed foods are a problem from a definitely metabolic perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And one of the beautiful things about the mitochondria is that they are interlaced to the whole body human function, that various systematic processes can impact them. So when we talk about ultra processed foods, what do they do that I don't think this is really too debatable anymore, is that high amounts of ultra processed foods can lead to overeating, and that can lead to obesity, right?
Yeah,
High
that's
amounts
our
of
angle.
high amounts of ultra processed foods have sugar. Many of them have high amounts of saturated fat, and both of those can lead to impairments of insulin sensitivity, or we would call it disrupted metabolic health. Both obesity and poor metabolism can both impact the mitochondria negatively, and has a feed-forward process where the mitochondria can then negatively contribute to the obesity and metabolic health aspect as well. So it really is this circular process to where if you create an overall unhealthy human body, the mitochondria are going to be impacted and can also be a causative factor in further issues, whether that be contributing to further obesity rates or even more impaired insulin sensitivity, or again, just poorer metabolic health. So it really is a dual communication there.
You're speaking about mitochondria as a sort of energy factory. Like that's where we get a lot of our energy. I've often thought that it was insulin sensitivity and glucose that gives us our energy. And now you're talking about how there's a feedback loop. So can you flesh that out a bit, please?
Sure. So the way I'll define it is the best evidence we have is with insulin resistance, right? Or our body's ability to use insulin and take glucose out of the blood, put it where it needs to go, like into our muscles, for example. So some of the pioneering work in this realm is out of John Kerwin's lab, who's a researcher here, and he does work on muscle mitochondria as it relates to type 2 diabetes, right? Type 2 diabetes is the downstream human clinical effect of someone having insulin resistance, right? So some of the early defects in our skeletal muscle that lead to the development of insulin resistance are actually disruptions to the mitochondrial network. So mitochondria don't just function as individual little organelles, right? They actually function in full networks that are fluid and change and move. And these mitochondria get disrupted at the earliest onset of insulin resistance. And the long-term development of that is type 2 diabetes. So we know that alterations negatively to the mitochondria, especially when it relates to their dynamics and how they function and their quality control systems, that is an early onset indicator of insulin resistance. So we know that it can play a causative role on that end. So when I mention, hey, there's this communication back and forth, when we, for example, induce insulin resistance in healthy individuals, and we do this through really cool experiments, by the way. So we do what's called like lipid infusions. So it's like healthy people, young, active, et cetera, right? Healthy body weight. And we put them in a clinical room and we actually infuse lipids into their body in excess. And what that does is that induces insulin resistance. So we can actually create sort of a type 2 diabetes phenotype in healthy individuals by creating this excess lipid.
And sugar either too, right?
You could, but really to induce the insulin resistance and that type 2 diabetes phenotype, you really have to do it with lipids. Okay. So the experiments we do with sugar are more assessing someone's level of insulin sensitivity. Yeah, so when we infuse like insulin and sugar into people, there's a really fancy procedure called the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. That's our gold standard way to assess someone's insulin sensitivity. And that's where we can say, okay, healthy people have a high insulin sensitivity, people with type 2 diabetes have a low insulin sensitivity. So that's what we do when we infuse sugar essentially into the system. But if we want to induce an insulin resistant phenotype, we do it with lipids. So we infuse these excess lipids, and one of the earliest primary items that is altered when we induce that insulin resistance is those mitochondrial dynamics and the mitochondrial energetics. Okay, and so that's how we know it's an early indicator.
Okay, so I have a question. You are a proponent of the ketogenic diet, right?
I would say I do research that is looking at different ways where the ketogenic diet can be beneficial. Okay. I've used the ketogenic diet myself, but I wouldn't stand up here and say I'm a proponent of the ketogenic diet, but I understand that it's many health benefits.
Good. So you're at least somewhat friendly to it. So I'm going to ask you this question because it's always puzzled me. We know that excess sugar causes insulin resistance, yes, and saturated fats. In the ketogenic world, there's a whole group of people that are saying saturated fats are not that bad and they don't cause insulin resistance. What do you say to that voice?
Yeah, so I mean, the isolation in the experiments we do, like we infuse saturated fats, they 100% cause insulin resistance in that setting. But we're really inducing a lipid overload, right? We're not taking someone in a normal healthy diet and having them consume certain amounts of saturated fats. Having said that, I do think there's a difference in the physiology of someone on a ketogenic diet that is a high amount of lipid use and turnover, where they're consuming maybe 2,000 calories of fats a day versus someone on a carbohydrate-based diet consuming a much smaller percentage of calories from fats, maybe 500 to 800 calories from fats per day. And the saturated fat effect in those two scenarios may be different, right? So there's a difference when you're consistently turning over fats and using them versus otherwise. So I don't want to dismiss the data that we have in carbohydrate-based diets.
Yeah.
We do want to minimize saturated fat when you have a carbohydrate-based diet. It's possible that impacts of saturated fat are different on a ketogenic physiology, which we know is very different from a carbohydrate-based physiology. I'll put it that way. But in terms of what we know about humans on a carbohydrate-based diet, if you infuse saturated fats, 100% of the time you induce insulin resistance.
You want to do the bacon fat, I forget what it is, bacon fat. As long as you're not also eating carbohydrates, you might be able to get away with it, but otherwise not.
And so let me say this too. Everyone that goes on a ketogenic diet, unless they lose a substantial amount of body weight, they will be more insulin resistant. So that is just a consequence of how we test insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance.
Okay.
So we have the clamp procedure that I mentioned where we infuse sugar into the body. If you put someone on a ketogenic diet, they will do worse if you then infuse carbohydrates into their body. But that's understandable, right? If you're not consuming carbs every day, then theoretically, why would you want to use a carbohydrate insult to test your insulin? But that's how we do the testing, right? So if you put someone on a ketogenic diet, they will generally perform worse if you test their insulin sensitivity. Same thing with the clinical oral glucose tolerance tests, right? So we use this to screen people for type 2 diabetes, or if anyone has had children, we often do this in pregnancy. You drink this carbohydrate-based beverage, doesn't usually taste that good, but you drink it and then we see how your blood sugar responds, right? If you go on a ketogenic diet, you will respond worse to that. Like it will look like you have worse oral glucose tolerance. And that's just inherent, again, to the body shifting to utilizing fats and ketones, and then us providing a carbohydrate sort of test to assess that. If we look just at the clinical measures, if you go on the ketogenic diet, you will do poorer on oral glucose tolerance tests and clamp tests if you ever have those stuff.
Okay. But if you're not eating carbohydrates, it's not a problem because
right. Then the concept is, what does that matter? If I'm not consuming carbs, why would I use a carbohydrate-based test? But again, clinically, it may be important if you're doing screening. One of the other things to consider is often people that go on a ketogenic diet use it to lose body weight. Losing body weight has a profound positive impact on the overall body system. So if you have someone that goes on the ketogenic diet, loses, let's say, 10, 15, 20 pounds, they will probably improve their insulin sensitivity and oral glucose tolerance test, right? Because they've lost so much weight, even though they're on the ketogenic diet. So I do want to create those distinctions as well for people that are trying to utilize the ketogenic diet to lose weight and improve metabolic health. Even though the ketogenic diet in isolation doesn't positively impact our carbohydrate-based measures like insulin sensitivity by the clamp or OGTTs, if you lose substantial body weight, you're going to have profound improvements across a variety of health metrics, including those metabolic ones as well.
If you wanted to be a purist, it sounds to me like saturated fats are not a good idea then. Good fats, yes, fine, but saturated fats, maybe not. And I'm thinking about you've got a child who is not yet insulin resistant. So you control their sugar intake if it's possible to do. We'll talk about that in a little while. But you might also want to control their saturated fat intake to preserve that child's potential for insulin resistance into the future.
Yeah, I would say in general, right? In general, you want to minimize saturated fats. There are situations like the ketogenic diet where you need large amounts of fat, where you might have more saturated fat than otherwise, but I'm not saying a ketogenic diet needs to have a ton of saturated fat. I like to use the terminology, like there's the bacon, butter, and beef ketogenic
that's
diet,
one I was going with.
which we see in like the lay populations. And then there's what I call the research grade ketogenic diet, or some people like Chris Gardner, amazing researcher out on the West Coast, has called like a well-formulated ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diets I use in my studies and other people use in theirs have lots of olive oil, fatty fish, right, where you're getting your omega-3s and omega-6s and these unsaturated fat items, avocados as their fruits, right? So yes, certainly, no matter what diet realm you're on, whether it's a carbohydrate-based diet or ketogenic diet, you really do want to minimize saturated fat based on what you can handle day to day. It's just on a ketogenic diet, it's likely that you may need sources of saturated fat just to make sure you can get up to your adequate energy intake. But I would certainly say in any situation, minimizing saturated fat is usually a good thing. It's just for some people, minimal is 5% of calories, and for other people, minimal is 10% of calories.
You've explained a little bit about the mitochondria and insulin resistance. What about other factors, not dietary, like genetics or the microbiome? What is their role in this?
Yeah, so certainly there are genetic factors that could have profound effects on obesity, especially childhood obesity, right? And we have those pretty well defined now when they're very stark and apparent, like Prader-Willi syndrome, for example. But there's others that just cause overeating in young individuals. And you can do genetic profiling, and this is clinical grade with your physician, right, to understand, hey, are there genetic defects leading to obesity? And so there's definitely clear genetic factors there. There's also people that are more susceptible to either the obesogenic environment or overeating, right? Items where we have advertising pointed at us all the time to eat more food. And here's this really cheap ultra processed food that's also super tasty, right? It's everywhere. And some people are just more susceptible to that sort of messaging. And then from the microbiome perspective, the microbiome is so responsive to about everything, right? So if you take someone and they're on a low ultra processed food diet or a high ultra processed food diet, it will 100% have different effects on the microbiome. What we don't exactly know is whether those microbiome differences have a further effect on whole body human physiology, right? There's terms that we use like dysbiosis, which is changes in the microbiome that have a negative effect, either overgrowth of harmful bacteria or essentially a diminishing of the healthy bacteria that we need as humans just to function in our gut. And when you have that level of dysbiosis, you have items like leaky gut syndrome that can cause infiltration of items that we don't normally absorb in our intestines into the bloodstream. This can cause an immune response and downstream inflammation and reactive oxygen species. And all of those, in turn, can negatively impact whole body human health, insulin sensitivity, potentially susceptibility to obesity, and definitely your mitochondria as well. So there's certainly connections. I think right now we're still on the early end of understanding how all of these different items connect, but we have enough of the whole body human data to say, hey, there are impacts of ultra processed foods or some of the additives in them or lack of certain items that are in our healthy foods that we would view as negatively impacting the gut microbiome. I'm not sure if we can go as far as saying ultra processed foods induce dysbiosis or really something where we would call it potentially having clinically relevant negative effects, but we know 100% that it affects it, and we generally assume that effect to be negative.
Now, there is a study where there's particular bacteria that support obesity and other bacteria that aren't, and that they've done fecal implants where if you put that bacteria into the mouse, you'll make the mouse obesogenic, where they might otherwise not have been.
Absolutely. The research is preclinical, but it was pretty startling when you could have these direct effects on the microbiome and have downstream effects on the whole animal physiology, specifically as it relates to obesity. We generally assume that concept can also be true in humans, but the magnitude is what is certainly the disconnect right now. So there's certainly items that we believe when you alter gut microbiome, it can have an effect on human physiology. Whether that's enough to be a causative role player in certain disease states or certainly obesity is still unknown, but it is interesting nonetheless. And I think certainly an area that we continually want to improve our research on. It wouldn't surprise me one day if we had probiotics that were specifically supportive of promoting a healthy body weight, but we're not there just yet.
Okay, so I guess it is a bit of a stretch now to say that ultra-processed foods support those bacteria that make a person obesogenic.
My specific area isn't the microbiome, so I don't know if we've targeted those specific strains of bacteria or those types, but I do know that you can impact, that ultra-processed foods will have an impact on your gut microbiome, and it's likely, based on all the other effects we see related to ultra-processed foods on human health, that we can generally probably consider those negative, but I don't think we've explicitly defined the precise changes. And especially with human variability, there's so much differences from you or I or someone even sitting right next to me. Our gut microbiome, even if we had all the same health metrics, is still going to be different. So I don't think we've really been able to target exactly what those changes are or what those changes may mean.
Mitochondrial dysfunction, can it affect appetite?
Yeah, so I don't know if those effects, I would say, necessarily filter through the mitochondria. But if we take a step back and we say, hey, can ultra-processed foods impact these items? I'd say, yeah, I think we have a pretty good understanding that if you have high amounts of ultra-processed food intake, we know that can induce overeating, right? Which long-term we know overeating leads to obesity, insulin resistance, heart disease, et cetera. I don't think we exactly have the connection to say, hey, we can have ultra-processed food intake. We know that impacts the microbiome. We know that may impact the mitochondria, and then that may impact these other items. So I think there's probably some gaps in the science to where we can't necessarily draw causative relationships. But I think we can take a step back and say, okay, what's the whole body human data we have? We know ultra-processed foods are going to be consumed more than non-ultra-processed foods, right? If the same person sits there and has the same foods in front of them, when you have ultra-processed foods, you're just going to eat more of them naturally. So I would generally consider that an appetite effect. I don't think we exactly know what biological mechanism underlines that appetite effect. Could it be related to palatability? Are there signals going to your brain? Are there signals with the incretins being related to GLP-1s and all the amazing effects we've seen from that really landscape-altering change that we've had in obesity medications? I think there's many different factors that can have an effect on appetite that could be related or underlying the ultra-processed food effect, but I think we're still trying to really identify what that is.
Getting back to the mitochondria and now children. So children they're new to all the impacts of food. Is their new, young mitochondria especially vulnerable to the foods that we're eating? And is it something that is adaptive, or can we fix that when the person's an adolescent or an adult? Like, how does the mitochondria go through a lifespan?
Yeah, so there's really two ways to look at this. I'm going to start with one way, which is children are amazingly resilient to negative influences. Not when it comes to the immune system, right? We know, okay, if you have flu or something, right, that is more impactful to the younger and the oldest adults, right? But when it comes to insulin resistance and obesity risk and us having these influences of ultra-processed foods or otherwise, children tend to be more resilient, right? If you look at obesity rates and just assume, hey, in the entire population, children or otherwise, we're all consuming more ultra-processed foods, adult overweight and obesity rates are 40 to 60%, whether or not you cut off at BMI of 25 for overweight or BMI of 30 for obesity. But children are half of that, right? Same thing with rates of cardiovascular disease and insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. They're always much lower in children. So one way you could look at that is say, hey, this growing human body with this high turnover and all of these changes is really creating a protective scenario where they can deal with those onslaughts and still stay insulin sensitive and not have obesity and otherwise. Another way to look at it is time under tension, right? Where, okay, as current aged adults, we're growing up maybe in the 80s, right, when the ultra-processed food intake was much lower than it is today. You can say, hey, they've only been under this obesogenic environment stress and ultra-processed food stress for a shorter period of time. And now we're having children that are going to be under that for the entirety of their lives. And I think the evidence in support of that being a potential negative factor is we're seeing shifts towards the left, meaning younger and younger individuals are getting higher and higher rates of the highest levels of obesity. So I think there's two ways to look at it. One, a youth body is extremely resilient, but two, do we really want to be putting negative stressors and pressure on it from such an early age? And is that going to lead to negative ramifications earlier than we've currently seen it in adults? And I would say, hey, if there's a negative factor that we know about, the more we can reduce the exposure to that negative factor for a longer period of time is probably going to be better, but that's all just postulation.
I tend to favor the second hypothesis, that it's the tension and the strain over time. And I'm thinking about the mitochondria. Would it be fair to think that over time, the mitochondria will become less resilient itself, less able to fulfill its function, which is to give us energy.
Yeah, I think it's possible. One of the gaps that we have as scientists is we really don't do a lot of mitochondrial studies in children. The mitochondrial studies that give us the most insight into mechanisms relating to insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity are skeletal muscle biopsies, right? And taking the mitochondria from the muscle tissue and assessing their function. And we just don't have that research in children. But I would generally align with your general thought that, hey, if we know there's some potential negative effects, whether or not we can scientifically prove that they're there, isn't it best for us to conform to an overall healthier lifestyle as early as we can and promote that from a perspective in the youth where it's going to potentiate long term, right? Because a lot of the ultra processed food intake and otherwise is taste preferences, palatability, habits. And those are items 100% that the earlier you build healthy habits, healthy taste profiles, right? Consuming your fruits and vegetables and your lean meats and otherwise. The earlier you do that, the more likely that is to lead forward to healthy habits downstream. So I think no matter how you look at it, whether or not we have the data to support the mitochondrial mechanisms in youth, which unfortunately we don't, I still think there's enough evidence to say, hey, when we take a step back and look at everything going on and all the evidence that we have, I would still sit here as a mitochondrial researcher and say, hey, it's probably best to limit ultra-processed food intake in youth as early as we can and as much as we can. Yeah. I'm not saying zero. Like ultra-processed food consumption in adults is 40 to 50% of our energy intake. In youths, it's upwards of 60%. So our children are getting more exposure than even adults to the ultra-processed foods as a percentage of their overall calories. And maybe that's based on convenience. Maybe that's just based on marketing. But it's definitely something that I think us in the clinical obesity realm view as problematic and something that we need to intervene on sooner or later.
Yeah. No, I was really interested in your hypothesis one, where you said that children maybe are more resilient. And my perspective coming into this interview was that actually children are more vulnerable because they haven't developed protections against these onslaughts of dietary toxins. But I guess that's more the perspective too.
Yeah, so I would view athletes somewhat similarly, where part of the reason we may think or have evidence that supports children being more resilient is that in athletes, there's the opposite effect, but they have negative effects of underfueling. They don't eat enough foods. But because the athletes look lean and they're relatively young, we have this overall perception that, hey, they are overall healthy and they don't need nutrition intervention. When the reality is just because their biomarkers haven't changed yet, or just because their overall physique hasn't changed yet, doesn't mean they're not negatively being impacted by the nutrition going in. And so that's when I say, just like the athletes, children are probably more resilient, where we won't likely see the same changes that we would see in adults in terms of negative biomarkers and otherwise. It doesn't mean that there's not negative effects of the food. It just means that we may not be able to realize it because their physiology has an ability to withstand that sort of onslaught, but that doesn't last forever.
It doesn't last forever, exactly. Okay, now you mentioned a couple of times biomarkers, and I know that's something that you talk about. Can you tell us what are some biomarkers? Are they clinically available to us? Can we use them to determine, aside from something like the continuous glucose monitor, what else is out there?
So are you looking for biomarkers in terms of health metrics or ultra-processed food intake?
I don't know. I think initially it was along the ideas of metabolic health or mitochondrial health, but
yeah, sure. So the metabolic health biomarkers, I think clinically we have really well defined in terms of cutoffs for oral glucose tolerance tests and otherwise. But I think items like we now have, like the continuous glucose monitors, that can be helpful in certain situations. I think in the media, CGMs or the continuous glucose monitors get a little embellished in terms of people worrying about their blood glucose changing too much, when they need to first understand, hey, there are normal day-to-day human changes in glucose that are normal and healthy. And it's only when the glucose reaches really high levels that we start to get concerned. But I do think for individuals that have a risk of that, having continuous glucose monitors or otherwise can be helpful for them to monitor. Certainly for people that are concerned or at risk and want that additional level of review other than their yearly one-day blood glucose screening that they get at their primary care physician if they attend it. So I think there's something to be said for more screening and monitoring of glucose-related items that can be helpful or get people to resources to help them modify their lifestyle better. Now, having said that, most of the people that we see purchasing these equipments and these biomonitors, or we have I don't want to name brands, but there's certain rings that you can wear to get these sensors. Usually those are people that have their health really aligned well. They have a great exercise lifestyle, they have a great nutrition lifestyle, and they're just getting more data behind it. So I don't think it's functionally used in the way that I think it would be most beneficial, which is helping people get screened better. But that's one of them. Other areas, just in my research, one of the areas I research is actually breath biomarkers.
I was going to ask about breath, yes.
Yeah, so outside of the work that I do in blood biometrics or precision nutrition, I also look at the breath as a potential biomarker, almost tissue of sorts, right? Where there are thousands of molecules in our breath that we just didn't quantify previously. Wow. And we're finding out more and more that these biomarkers can be related to many items, be it human physiology. Our lab was the first to kind of indicate that malnutrition showed up in the breath, but other people have defined cancer, even staging of different cancers. Certainly environmental and toxin exposures will show up in the breath, whether that be from
some gut biome as well.
There are 100% gut biome indicators that show up in the breath also. Some we use clinically, right? So if there's bacterial overgrowth, we have certain tests we do that can come up in the breath if you just measure one molecule. But there's actually molecules in the breath. There's profiles of maybe 20 or 30 different molecules that you can use to be indicative of changes in bacterial strains in your gut as well. So there's non-invasive ways to assess gut microbiome status in the breath also. So it really, in my mind, that is an emerging area of research. I don't think we have anything just yet outside of like currently used clinical breath biomarkers, which are like nitric oxide is used in asthma, right? So you can take a breath sample and understand, okay, whether someone is likely to have asthma, or certainly if they have inflammation in their airways, usually related to asthma and otherwise. But outside of that, to me, it's an exciting area of future research where we may be able to identify these non-invasive biomarkers from our breath or otherwise to be indicators of not just human health and disease, but maybe preclinical items like insulin sensitivity or otherwise. So that's all stuff in the works.
We've talked in the early days about how you could tell that somebody had diabetes by the smell of their breath. So this is just a further expansion of that.
Absolutely, exactly. Yeah.
So do you think that you might be able to actually determine somebody who might be pre-diabetic or almost?
I will say I have ongoing research where we're trying to identify the breath in those situations. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Is there anything clinical on that front? I know that you can get some stuff for the gut biome.
Yeah, so it's specific overgrowth of H. pylori, which is a specific bacterial overgrowth that is used clinically. Yeah. Otherwise, it's all really experimental. So I'm trying to think of, we have the blood alcohol level that you can get in your breath. Ketones are pretty accurate, although we don't usually use that clinically. Breath nitric oxide is used in asthma or some of the other pulmonary conditions. And then the hydrogen, which is the H. pylori. I think those are probably the main ones that we currently use clinically. Research-wise, we've always measured oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide generation for basal metabolic rates, whether you're utilizing carbs or fats as fuel, or testing for exercise capacity. Maybe you've heard the term VO2 max, right? The amount of oxygen that you consume maximally as you're exercising to be an indicator. It's really our best indicator of longevity and overall fitness. Those are all used in both the clinical and research realm. We've got a long way to go on the breath field in terms of not just identifying the biomarkers, but then validating them in different populations. So it's an emerging area of research, but it's got a ways to go.
I did hear you say that the keto tests that you can buy, breath tests, are pretty good. You would say that?
I would say the breath acetone as an indicator of the breath acetone levels as an indicator of overall ketone levels generally works, but I would always still use blood measures. Okay. I think acetone is accurate and it shows up in those situations like you had mentioned classically in those people with those overt type 2 diabetes where they're undergoing kind of the ketoacidosis realm. I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be something we use clinically because we don't necessarily need to measure that from the breath in that setting. Yeah, I'd say it's accurate, but I don't think there's a need for it because the blood finger pricks are so good as well.
Okay, so now I want to get to the keto plan. the treatment. And you had already said that you have a specific way of envisioning a good keto plan. What would you say would be the best diet? And I'm now thinking specifically about children.
To me, for children, there's different ways to look at this. I have 2 young children myself. To me, with children, my goal is to optimize growth potential and make sure they have all the energy and nutrients they need for optimal growth and development. So in children, that's what I tend to look at. I tend to give higher amounts of protein than maybe the average person to children and make sure they have all their broad spectrum micronutrients. But outside of that, it's more, in my mind, in terms of a healthy diet, is creating habits and food and taste preferences that are going to lead to, when they become more independent, their ability to select a diet that's healthiest for them. To me, it's less specific foods for children and more providing a variety of nutrients, making sure you're optimizing growth through the macro or the energy provision and micronutrients, and then just creating an opportunity for them to develop a varied palate and make sure that when they go to consume a food and they have options in front of them, they're selecting the items that are high in not just the energy and macronutrients that they need and or even the micronutrients, but the phytochemicals and the zoochemicals and these items that we know are overall beneficial for human health.
So I'm just trying to translate that into what that would actually look like on the plate for the day. It sounds to me like it would be what we might call soft keto. There would be a certain number of vegetables, like maybe, 50 grams of carbs.
No, I mean, to me, my daughter is a youth gymnast. So she's actually a state champion down here. I'm in Louisiana in the USA, and she's a state champion at level 1 and level 2. So she has tons of carbohydrates in her diet because she's extremely active. I think on average, we're probably at maybe 2 to 3 hours of activity a day, if not more. And that's between training or items that I do with my kids, which is just play around at the parks or the gyms. So I don't look to minimize carbohydrates in youth. I really look to make sure that they're hitting their growth curves and that they have enough of the nutrients available. To me, the only item that I try to specifically portion is protein to make sure that they're having optimal levels. In my mind, the data in children from the earliest days support higher amounts of protein per kilogram than we use as adults. And so that's really what I try to manipulate for my children, is making sure, hey, are they getting enough protein and calories and all of their micronutrients?
Can I nail you down a little bit more? Would that be like 5 or 6 ounces ounces, that I use ounces of protein in a meal or more?
No, not for them. I have young children, so they're 3.5 and 8. Size-wise, they're only, let's see, what's their weight in kilograms? Like, 15 to 30 kilograms. Yeah, I'd say like half of that. I generally aim to give them like 1 to 2 ounces of lean protein in every meal. We eat a good 4 meals a day, probably. They always have, the thing with kids is, to me, I always provide them more food than they'll ever eat on a plate, but it's always giving a variety.
Yes.
They'll have vegetables on there, they'll have the lean protein, they'll have a dairy, they'll have their fruit, and that's always available to them. And some days they eat more of some than others, but generally to me, it's providing variety for children and giving them different tastes to get accustomed to. I think we don't give credit for different food items and tastes being acquired, like more so than the kids often. And I can't tell you how many times this happened with my children. I'll give them a food for the first time, they don't like it. Give it to them again, they don't like it. But then all of a sudden it's a part of our normal day-to-day and they'll eat it like crazy. And all of a sudden it's their favorite food. So with children, to me, it's really more exposure and variety and focusing on items that are nutrient dense. Your whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, your lean proteins, your dairies, and giving them a mix of all that.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that with Brussels sprouts. I used to hate them and now they're my favorite. How do you get them as children to not be overexposed to processed foods? Because ultra processed foods will, and this is really a practical question, not a science question. As a father, like, they're going to be exposed. That always wins over real food.
Yeah, the ultra-processed food item is a major issue, not just because of the potential negative effects on the body, but because it is targeted more towards people that have less time and less money and less ability to cook all the meals. I love cooking. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I'd say, like, with my children, just as an example, we'll get fast food less than monthly. It will happen if we're out at an event or something. And so I cook the vast majority of our meals, and that's not something that every person has the ability to do based on their time and work and money and just mental energy to do that, or just culinary skills. So it is extremely difficult. I don't have great advice other than you need to make it a priority if that's something that you have the ability to prioritize. Some people, and I grew up in a very modest household, I'm very empathetic to needing to utilize ultra processed foods in situations because they are less expensive. They are ready at your hands. They're available. They're often items that you'll find at the food banks and otherwise. And I very much understand the utility of ultra processed foods in our food environment and for people that need to utilize that. And so I certainly don't want to create any sort of like negative shame towards parents that utilize ultra processed foods because of the necessity. And it's just advertised to us. Half of them say they're healthy from the label. And so there's also a disconnect between the advertising and the marketing of ultra processed foods and otherwise. To me, it's just putting your best effort to get your kids as many whole foods as you can to the best of your ability. And I think that's different for every single person. And as I mentioned, kids are resilient. They'll be okay. But the more often you can push towards the fruits, the vegetables, the whole grains, the lean proteins, the dairy products that are not ultra processed, I think the better off you're going to set your children up for long-term potential, especially as they gain independence and make more of their own food choices.
Yeah. So with the exposure and the habit that's been ingrained because they're eating your food, so they're an ideal test case. Do you find that they then prefer your food over McDonald's or some kind of ultra-processed food?
I would say they don't ask for, this is very individualized. I have no idea if this expands to other people. Yeah, my children don't ask to really go out for anything. They'll ask to get ice cream. We definitely go get ice cream. Like I'm not, you know what I mean? But yeah, my daughter will ask for steak, right? I cook sliders all the time, do a lot of chicken, right? My daughter's a bit fancy. She loves lobster, so I'll grab like those frozen lobsters from, I'm a Sam's Club guy. That's one of the local bulk markets around here in the U.S. But yeah, we'll throw those up. But yeah, I don't know. I'd say probably, but if we're driving along and my daughter sees a Wendy's and she's hungry, she'll ask for it for sure. So I don't think it's really stopping them from seeing all the marketing and everything out there. And it's certainly not stopping them from enjoying like the flavor of these hyper palatable foods. Fast foods are enticing for a reason. I don't think anything we really do is ever going to fully combat that level of advertising and palatability. When she gets older, as a dietitian, my goal is to convey the importance of when you're choosing your foods to be choosing them at home and know that there's always going to be advertising and marketing that's going to drive you to eat somewhere else. And then you have to consciously combat that. And it's extremely difficult.
Okay. The standard dietary advice is not exactly what you're saying. How do you find what you say fits with the standard? I know you're not a clinician, but yeah.
Oh, so in part, I am a clinician. I do run a private practice as well outside of research. I do find that all of my recommendations align with our generally recommended dietary guidelines. So I don't think anything I've said here or otherwise can't fit within the context of what, at least here in the U.S., our dietary guidelines suggest people intake. And I think all of those can be modified for clinical situations. So even though I do research on potential benefits of the ketogenic diet in different clinical realms, when you have a disease or disorder or otherwise, modifying your diet to specifically impact that aligns very well with the dietary guidelines for Americans. Even though maybe someone on a ketogenic diet can't fit that same profile, the dietary guidelines for Americans still allow the flexibility for people that have unique disease or nutritional needs to modify their diet. Same thing with children. I don't think anything I've said would misalign with our national guidelines.
Okay. Although metabolic disease is no longer that unique. It's almost become the standard.
And that's a concerning thing in itself, right? Yeah. 100%. I do, in my mind, I'm a proponent of the dietitian profession. I think every single person should see a dietitian every year at minimum, just like they see their primary physician. And then the more you can instill conscious thought and independent thinking into your nutrition, the better you're going to be. Anything we can do to combat just eating due to marketing or advertising or availability I think someone's going to be healthier and better for it.
The GLP-1s, which you mentioned, do you feel, it's my impression that since they've come on the scene, that dietary advice, which was always not that high up there, other than how to lose weight, might now get lost in the excitement about the GLP-1s. What's your take on that?
Oh, I think just the opposite, actually. And I think we have evidence to even support that. If you remember early on in the data from these weight loss trials with semaglutide or GLP-1s or otherwise, stay off name names, the GLP-1 receptor agonists or any of the incretin mimetic drugs.
Yes.
Early on, there was a profound amount of muscle loss that came with the weight loss. In these early trials, I'm trying to think like Sustain 8 or the early step trials, with those larger muscle mass losses, didn't have the lifestyle support that is instilled in the later trials. So when they provided additional support for nutrition and exercise and otherwise, the muscle loss risk has all but been eliminated. So to me, that shows a greater focus on nutrition and exercise and overall lifestyle can work to really promote the optimal effect of these medications. So I view it as very exciting. Now, certainly, if you just say from a weight loss perspective, hey, if you just take the medications, it's going to outperform pretty much any dietitian. I tell that to people that come to my clinic for weight management. I do say, hey, we have intensive behavioral therapy that we can do. And data suggests we can help you lose and maintain about 5% of your body weight. Outside of what our clinic does, meds will outperform that. Like it just has that large of an impact on food selection and eating behavior. So I do let people know that. I think as dietitians, we need to be realistic about it and say, hey, if it's just for weight loss, the meds are better than dietitians now. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have dietitians with the meds. It's just where we're at. Because you said that you can virtually eliminate muscle loss? You can make muscle loss equivalent to non-medication induced muscle loss. So it eliminates the excessive risk that was found in earlier trials. That's actually very optimistic. I haven't heard such an optimistic statement. Okay, our final question is a signature question that we ask everybody, and that is if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about ultra-processed foods or about the work that you do, what would it be? Oh man, let's see. I think there was a time in my life where I didn't focus as much on consuming like fruits and vegetables. So I would tell my younger self the same advice that I give as generic advice to everybody, which is like every day, make sure you pick up a fresh fruit and pick up a fresh vegetable and eat it. Like you should be able to do that at least every day, is have some sort of fresh produce. And that I think there was a point in my life where like I assessed how I was as a dietitian and I'm like, man, my daily diet is not where it needs to be. And I think if I would have told myself that earlier, I maybe would have focused on that a little more than I just focus on generic athlete stuff like protein intake and otherwise. Good. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Yeah, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on. And I hope you and any of the listeners enjoy the conversation. I love talking about nutrition. So if anyone has follow-up questions or anything, I don't know if you can provide my email address for those, but I am happy to chat about it or converse over email. It's what I enjoy doing, so I'm happy to talk. I'll put your email in the show notes then. Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group. I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.